I would do. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today in the CIRRELT and McGill Transport Seminar. It's lovely to bring back Dea van Lierop, who was a former student here, and she was sitting in this room, let's say, when my son was newborn. She was here as a student, and now she's a big professor in Utrecht in the Netherlands. She has been there for several years, and she's leading an amazing group of students over there, and she has been doing some magnificent work over the past years. And I'm really happy to bring her back, and that she agreed to be with us to talk to you about some of her research. Thank you so much, Dea, for coming back.
Yeah, thank you so much for your invite, Ahmed. As you mentioned, I remember keenly sitting and attending these lectures as a student, so that's more than 10 years ago now. So it's my absolute honor to speak to all of you today. And as Ahmed mentioned, I'm now an assistant professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And here I teach and do research on transportation planning with a focus on equity and inclusion in mobility planning. And before I made the move to Utrecht University, I worked also at the Toronto Transit Commission in the Wheel-Trans division. So as you can see, accessibility planning and equity and inclusion in planning and in mobility have always been very close to my heart. And I'll be talking about some of those themes more today. So today I will be discussing micromobility and shared mobility with a focus on equity and inclusion. And I also want to mention that most of the work presented is based on studies taking place in Utrecht. So I hope that you will enjoy exploring a new context. Probably it's a new context to most of you. And I hope that you're going to enjoy exploring this context together with me today. And I also want to mention that much of the work presented today has been a team effort, of course, and has been led by fabulous and talented postdoc research, PhD candidates, and master's students. And of course, without their input, this presentation would not have been possible at all. So let's get started. There are many urban and mobility challenges that are requiring planners, policymakers, researchers, but also transportation users more broadly to rethink the current and sometimes the status quo mobility systems that our cities offer. For example, we are thinking about mobility and emissions. So the mobility sector contributes 23.5% of the Dutch emissions. And many places in the world, this figure sits around 25% of the total emissions. And despite climate targets, emissions from traffic and aviation are increasing. And in the Netherlands, emission increased by 10% in 2022, nearing pre-pandemic levels. So you see there are significant increases in petrol and diesel consumption, and these also reflect rising car use despite sustainability efforts at different levels of government. We see that different levels of government are also working on different kinds of climate agreements to meet CO2 and emission reduction goals. So, for example, the Dutch Climate Agreement aims to reduce CO2 emissions by 49% by 2030 and by 95% in 2050. And of course, mobility is critical. It's a critical sector in achieving these targets. But progress is lagging due to also increased car use and emissions from transportation. So there is this increase in car ownership. This is also happening in the Netherlands, true also in other countries. So for example, car ownership in the Netherlands has risen to nearly 500 cars per 1,000 residents. And we're also starting to see larger cars taking to the streets. And of course, they take up more urban space. They contribute emissions, congestion, and of course, also parking demand. And there are other challenges that also are having us rethink how we travel. So for example, other important considerations are related to urbanization, population growth, aging society. Growing populations and expanding urbanization increase the pressure on urban infrastructure and the mobility needs. And cities, they need to balance housing shortages, improving air quality, reducing emissions, while also addressing these changing mobility demands, because of the demands of mobility, of course, are also changing. And the mobility needs of an aging population, they also require adaptable and inclusive transportation options. So this is the background upon which I want to start here, that we really do need to start thinking about mobility in different ways. And we also, of course, have not always thought about mobility in different ways. And we'll get into the historical part in a little bit. But when you sign up to attend this seminar, you may have thought that I was going to tell you that here in the Netherlands, we're a country where everyone rides their bicycle all the time. Even though we do have high mode shares of bicycling and high bicycle usage within cities, we also have our fair share of car addiction, I would argue. And in the figure here, you can see an overview of current transport modes, and you can see the dominance of car travel. So no matter if you consider the number of trips, the kilometers traveled, or the hours spent traveling. So despite the Netherlands' reputation for cycling, car use far exceeds public transport and cycling as a primary mode of transport. And public transit and cycling account for a much smaller share of the trips compared to car travel. Therefore, there is a need to change how we travel, as active and communal modes tend to be more environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. So to address this, urbanization, emissions, and congestion, and the shift towards sustainable transport, and specifically I'm talking here about cycling, walking, and public transport, this shift really is essential. And with these growing environmental and mobility challenges, we need to promote these alternative modes. And as I mentioned, this can't just come from individuals, but also this is, of course, a collective a collective goal that we need to work towards as governments, individuals, activists, researchers, all working together. So I am giving this presentation from the city of Utrecht. I'm sitting in my office. You can probably see that by the background. It's not a fake background. It is really what my office looks like. And many of the cases that I will show you relate to the city, though. So the city of Utrecht that I'm in. So I think it's important that I introduce you properly to this beautiful city, and maybe you'll feel interested in visiting the city at some point. It is the fastest growing city in the Netherlands, and it has the desire to become climate neutral by 2030. Utrecht is one of the leading cities in sustainable mobility in Europe, and it is known for its forward-thinking and collaborative municipal government. And the city has a very young energy since it's a student city. There's a university here, and there are several important colleges. Utrecht municipality claims to have a strong commitment to the inclusion of all its citizens in its planning processes and policies. It also has quite well-developed policy and documentation on sustainable mobility goals. The city emphasizes the importance of recognizing and accommodating local differences, what they call, and it underscores the necessity of addressing diverse needs of various social groups with the aim to make transportation accessible for all of its citizens. So several official documents acknowledge shared mobility as a tool which could reduce transport poverty. And in the year 2020, the policy documents first mentioned transport poverty. And in 2022, I would like to read a quote from one of the policy documents. The city says that shared mobility can potentially play a role in reducing transport poverty among groups that have a difficulty accessing mobility, for example, people with a low income. So here we see that the city makes this connection between shared mobility and transport poverty, and that this could be an option for alleviating transport poverty. So the in the slides that proceed, I will give you some examples of research that look at this relationship between shared mobility and transport poverty in Utrecht. But before we go look at research from now and some of the research that my group is working on right now, or that I'm working on together with my co-authors, or before we think about the future, I think it's really important also to look at the past. So let's take a look at how low car policies have changed the way that cities look like. And here I'm referring specifically to cities in the Netherlands. So on the left, you can see one of the main streets in the city center of Utrecht around 1960. And on the right, you can see the very same street, and you can see how it looks like. Well, this was photos from 2017. It doesn't look so different today. And we see buses, we see cyclists and pedestrians in both photos, right? We even see the bicycle in almost the same place. But on the left, we see cars, and we see large open areas for cars to drive on. We also see buses and cars sharing the same road. Well, on the right, we don't see any cars. And this is because the infrastructure here favors collective and active modes, meaning buses, bicycles, and pedestrians. So this street, which is called the Potterstraat, is a prime example of the shift from a car-centric planning to people-friendly urban planning. So the focus on active and shared transportation has not always been the norm. And if you look at this figure, it becomes very clear that the bicycle mode share in Amsterdam, here we have Amsterdam, it would have been very similar in Utrecht, but this figure shows Amsterdam if you look at the yellow line. So the mode share in Amsterdam, it dropped from 80% to 20% between the years 1950 and 1970. And of course, this is right at the time of post-war car infrastructure expansion. So as you can see, similar patterns in terms of mode share occurred in many European cities. So what we see here is a photo of a major area of a Dutch city being cleared to make way for the new auto-centric infrastructure. But as we know now, this increasing car use resulted in many negative externalities related to pollution, congestion, and also, very importantly, traffic safety, with an increase in collision and traffic-related deaths. So of all of the experienced negative externalities, the one related to safety was one of the most important. This is something that's similar in the dialogues today. And here we see photos from the Stop de Kindermoord, or Stop the Child Murder movement. And this was a civic movement which most pushed for low car cities, with a focus on how to make cities safer for all, especially for children who tended to be cyclists and pedestrians. This has not changed. We still see many children walking, for example, to school or riding their bike, and of course, being very vulnerable on the road. We can see the importance that civic activism has played in significantly shaping the urban environment in the Netherlands, especially when it comes to cycling infrastructure. The Stop the Kindermoord movement challenged entrenched government policies that favored car use and pushed for meaningful change. It's true that today in the Netherlands, there's a high number of cyclists, and it's quite a safe cycling environment also. But it wasn't always this way. Early cycle paths were narrow, poorly maintained, disconnected. As we saw in the previous slides, after World War II, economic growth led to a rise in car ownership, and cities were restructured to prioritize motorized vehicles. Cycling dropped significantly, with rates dropping by 6% annually during this car-centric period. The impact was devastating. By 1971, traffic fatalities had soared to over 3,300 lives lost in a single year, including more than 400 children under the age of 14. So this sparked public outcry and led to the movements like Stop the Child Murder, which these photos are from, and which advocated for safer streets for pedestrians and for cyclists. These protests highlighted the dangers of mass motorization and pushed for change. So we see a turning point happening in the 1970s with the 1973 oil crisis. And this crisis wasn't just about energy, it became also a moment of reflection. So government and society began to focus on reducing energy dependency while maintaining a high quality of life for people. So car-free Sundays, for example, became a symbol of what cities could look like with reduced motor traffic. inspiring the creation of permanent car-free zones in city centers. Municipalities started experimenting with dedicated cycling routes, and cities like Tilburg and The Hague, they greatly expanded cycle paths, and the results were dramatic. Cycling rates increased by 30 to 75% in the country, and they demonstrated that infrastructure investments could reverse this decline in mode share. The success turned cycling into a cornerstone of both national and municipal transport policies. The outcomes of these efforts are extraordinary. Child fatalities in traffic dropped from over 400 in the early 1970s to just 14 in recent years. Civic advocacy led to the implementation of dedicated cycling paths and permanent cycling infrastructure. And today, Dutch cities prioritize cycling and pedestrian access over motorized traffic in many areas. The challenges faced by the Netherlands in urban traffic and safety are not unique to the Netherlands. The solutions developed here, so those prioritizing cycling, reducing car dependency, and engaging civic movements, can serve as a model for other countries grappling with similar issues. So ultimately, the story reminds us of the meaningful change that begins with collective action and innovative policies. So a final example I want to give you based on a transformation that's related to protests is what we see here. So we see two examples. One on the left, we see how a highway project was converted back into a beautiful canal. And if you look closely at these photos, you can see on the set of photos on the left, where it says 1980 and 2022, you can see the same church in both of those photos. So it really is exactly the same spot and the same location, and the transformation is magnificent. And before the 1980s, in the 1950s and in the 60s, there was actually a canal where that highway was. But in 1959, Veuchtigen's plan aimed to enhance car flow by demolishing the canals, which led to public backlash. Similar planning practices were happening in the 1970s and 80s in many places in the industrialized West, where we see communities and public spaces being developed into highways. And although this area was turned into a highway, there were many critics, which included neighborhood groups, students, leftist activists, and they began to demonstrate about what had happened to this public space. And the preservation of Utrecht's canals stemmed from these grassroots movements, where community activism led to significant urban planning decisions being made. So public protest successfully advocated for sustainable transportation options, shaping policies from the ground up. If you look at the 2022 picture, you now see a place where people can walk along this area. There's a bike path that you can't see very well, but is also along this canal. It's a place where you can play, you can hang out, sit on benches, enjoy the greenery. You can also do different kinds of activities on the water. And so really a place for active travel and for leisure. On the right, what we see is the Neude Square, which is one of the main squares in the city of Utrecht. And we see that it was converted from a parking lot back to a public space in the 1990s. Again, illustrating the city's shift towards pedestrian-friendly environments. What we don't see in this picture is that sometimes the nice pedestrian area has turned into a large-scale bicycle parking area, which sometimes is so chaotic that it's not possible to walk there properly, which is another issue that the city is tackling right now and doing a very good job of, because they have now installed public bicycle parking facilities close by too, which keeps the public space also open to pedestrians. So again, this idea that active travel, leisure, and using public space as a place for encounters being something that is high on the policy agenda. So today, Utrecht, which is the fastest growing city in the Netherlands, it faces significant mobility challenges. And it has a growing population that's projected to grow by over 100,000 by the year 2040. This means that trips are also expected to increase, and the prediction here is by about 35%. And Utrecht, still under these conditions, it aims to lead Europe in sustainable urban mobility, and also achieve climate neutrality by 2030. So to manage this growth, the city focuses on 3 strategies: smart development, behavioral change, and network improvement. By building near transport hubs, expanding cycling and public transport networks, and using smart traffic management systems, Utrecht is creating a future of sustainable and accessible urban mobility. And this also includes reducing on-street parking and reclaiming public space for green areas and pedestrians. So what I would like to do now is shift towards showing some of the research that we have been doing in the city of Utrecht, with Utrecht University and some of our partners. And specifically, I want to focus on the research that we've been doing, planning for shared micromobility and active travel in Utrecht. So the first study that I would like to share is related to the master's thesis work of Jasmijn van der Kraat. And because of Utrecht's rich history with planning for sustainable mobility, what we wanted to do was understand how the policy framework surrounding sustainable mobility changed over time. So we did this by analyzing a total of 35 policy documents spanning the period from 2005 to 2022. And the timeline represents key highlights in the documents. So, for example, in 2005, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans were introduced by the European Commission, and they were also used in Utrecht. So in the initial years, the discourse centered around electrifying transport, so electric cars, electric bikes, electric public transport, for example. Recently, attention has shifted to sharing, so sharing different modes. And here there's been specifically a focus on mobility hubs and so shared mobility hubs. So these are hubs, I'll show you some photos in a minute, where you have different kinds of shared mobility available at a central point within the city. There's also been a greater focus more recently on shared micromobility. In addition, there has been a focus on transport poverty, and this was mentioned for the first time in 2020 and again in more recent documents. So we can see that there is a policy shift towards alleviating transport poverty, also measuring transport poverty, and also more active and also more shared modes. The way we did the analysis is that the documents were categorized into 3 successive phases. So the pre-smartphone years, so this is 2005 to 2010, the digital period, which we said that was somewhere around 2011 to 2019, and then the COVID-19 phase. So here we're talking about 2020 to 2022. And these phases reflected significant developments in societal trends and mobility behavior. So the word clouds, they illustrate the breakdown of this timeline based on the sustainable mobility initiatives in the policy documents during each phase. Of course, the word size indicates the frequency of the words being referenced or being referred to. So what we see in the pre-smartphone era is that there's a focus on traditional modes of transport, such as public transport, cars, and active travel. And with the introduction of smartphones, mobility patterns began to change, leading to increased data availability on transportation and behavior. Notably, smartphones facilitated the rise of new mobility services, including shared mobility, of course, because of digital payment systems, and GPS and mapping that's available on phones. And of course, this heavily relied on other aspects of the smartphone usage. There's an emphasis, so the emphasis then shifted towards car restriction policies, including the reduction of parking spaces and the establishment of car-free zones, alongside increased attention to shared micromobility. We see in the digital period that there's a focus on sustainable transportation more generally. And as we shift to the COVID-19 phase, we see that the pandemic significantly altered travel patterns in the Netherlands, causing a shift from public transport to more private modes. Privately used modes. So this could also include, for example, shared mobility, where you are using it by yourself, but it is still a shared micromobility mode, such as, for example, an electric shared bicycle or an electric cargo bicycle. But this also relates to car sharing. In our examination of these sustainable urban mobility plans, we also reveal that while various societal groups are mentioned, the documents often use general terms such as residents or Utrechters. Yet, we do see some changes over time. So we see that the transport disadvantaged groups are also gaining more attention. For example, people with a disability being mentioned more often, and the financial crisis triggering more attention to people who are unemployed. So what we then did is we evaluated the inclusion of socially disadvantaged groups identified in the literature. Our analysis of the documents in the literature identified 7 important groups for this particular case: low-income families, people with disabilities, older adults, children, teenagers, migrants, and or underemployed. However, recognizing the diversity within socially disadvantaged groups is crucial to effective urban mobility planning. And while many of the disadvantaged groups are mentioned in the sustainable urban mobility plans, specific subgroups were often faded into the background after the initial recognition. So, for example, in Utrecht, mobility plans grouped all older adults together, leading to inadequate provisions for the more active younger seniors compared to the older counterparts who may require more assisted transportation options. Additionally, there were plans that specifically mentioned refugees or status holders, but they overlooked other migrant groups like expats, for example, or international students who may face different challenges. So if you look at these maps, the dark blue represents neighborhoods where socially disadvantaged groups are concentrated. It is, of course, important to note that not everyone in a socially disadvantaged area is deprived, and likewise, everyone who is deprived does not necessarily live in a socially disadvantaged area. Shared mobility services in Utrecht are predominantly available in advantaged neighborhoods. So we can see the orange dots represent the mobility hubs, which I will show you some photos on in the next slide, and the red dots representing car sharing services. And we see most of these in the lighter areas, so the less socially deprived neighborhoods. While the vulnerable residents in the peripheral neighborhoods, they appear to have limited access. So this suggests that even though there is an explicit policy designed to reduce transport poverty through shared mobility planning, the distribution of the new modes is not always the most advantageous for the populations who could benefit the most. So when we asked if there was a mismatch in these policy interventions, we did find that in many areas, not all, there was still a mismatch. So in 2023, Utrecht established 14 neighborhood mobility hubs, shared mobility hubs. These hubs serve as a centralized location for shared vehicles and feature standardized national signage. So you can see that signage here in the green, black, and white on the left. We can see a photo of a hub in the neighborhood that I live by, close to the city center on the right. So you can see a red car share, an electric shared bicycle in that kind of blue teal color, and a shared electric cargo bicycle on the left. And if I go quickly back to the previous slide for you to see, you can see that they are located where these orange dots are. So they are located in different areas of the city. We also see that there is an increase in the uses and the uptake of shared modes in Utrecht. So we see that the absolute number of commercial shared cars in Utrecht has grown from over 500 in 2020 to about 1,000 in 2023. And based on the 2023 resident survey, the city found that 30% of Utrecht households, someone in a household used a shared car from a commercial organization in the past 12 months. Additionally, 36% of households reported using public transport shared bike. They are not pictured in this photo, but they are not an electric, so a conventional shared bike that are usually available at train stations. And the survey also showed that 11% used an electric shared bike, for example, a tier bicycle, which is depicted here in the blue color on the right. And notably, since 2022, shared scooters are no longer available in Utrecht. This is because the vision of Utrecht was really about active travel and cycling and walking, and not scooter usage. Scooters here, referring to the moped type shared mobility. So I want to share some results from additional research. So we wanted to know who had access to shared mobility in Utrecht. And so this research is done together with my co-authors Xiaodong Guan, Zihao An, Eva Heinen, and Dick Ettema. And we wanted to assess who used different kinds of shared mobility in Utrecht and two other European cities. This project is part of the Complementing and Complementary Mobility Solutions in Urban Contexts project. We refer to it as the COCOMO project. And we first asked what equitable transportation looked like, focusing on transport equity and defined as the fair and appropriate distribution of transport benefits and costs among individuals or population groups. We wanted to know who had access regarding the allocation of the services and whether the provided services improved the travel conditions of specific disadvantaged groups. So this collaboration was with Utrecht University, of course, where I'm located, Lund University in Sweden, and the University of Leeds in the UK. And given the recency of introducing many new kinds of shared micromobility in European cities, there still is a lack of knowledge about the implications of shared micromobility for travel behavior, specifically with regard to sustainability and inclusion, and how shared micromobility is best combined with existing transportation options, both in terms of trip organization and of course the use of public space also. So in this project, which we could refer to as COCOMO, we focus on the central question: how can shared micromobility best be combined with existing transport systems, and how can it be interwoven into existing urban layouts to increase accessibility for all and add to sustainable transportation solutions? And so what you can see here on the slide is the cycling rate of these three different cities, and you can see that there are quite big differences. So we wanted to understand who experiences transport poverty. Do people who experience transport poverty use shared micromobility services the same as people who are not experiencing transport poverty, or maybe they use it less or more? We wanted to understand whether shared micromobility really can help reduce transport poverty, as this is something that is mentioned in many policy documents, but there's not strong evidence toward that provided in those documents. And we also wanted to understand whether transport poverty groups, or the groups who are experiencing transport poverty, if they benefit equally from shared micromobility adoption. So what we found is that shared micromobility can, of course, influence transport equity in two ways. There can be a positive impact, so additional transport options are available, right? So there are more modes available, and which could be a way to alleviate transport poverty. It can also serve as a good first or last mile option to public transportation, for example, a train or a metro. But there can also be a negative impact, of course, if there is unequal distribution of shared micromobility services, or if people have experienced barriers, for example, a digital barrier, a physical barrier, an economic barrier. Um, with all of these services, it's important to have some kind of literacy, digital literacy, not only to use the mobility apps, but of course also online payment apps. And so these are all potential barriers that could play a role in accessing these modes. So what we did is we collected survey data in these different cities, and we had nearly 2,000 valid complete responses. And you can see sometimes that there is a line here showing that there's missing data. That's because that particular mode was then not available for a particular city. So, for example, if you look at the cargo bike, the vehicle with the big the big yellow box in the front, you can see this was only available in Utrecht, for example. Um, and considering the different spatial contexts, we ran separate models and separate analyses for each of the three cities. And we ran two different kinds of analyses. One was to really understand shared micromobility usage, understanding the social demographics, the built environment, and the mobility instrument. Um, and the second was to better understand transport poverty in these areas. So what we found is that people who are older, females, low income, and those who use a mobility device are less likely to use shared micromobility. We also found that people with low access to public transport or low access to their own micromobility devices, so having, for example, a scooter or a bicycle in low density areas, were also less likely to use shared micromobility. The majority of the respondents in all three cities reported a similar or increased accessibility since the introduction of these shared micromobility services, suggesting that the use of shared micromobility did help improve accessibility to some extent. This is also the case for shared e-bike use and travel costs in Manchester. However, we found that many more shared bike users in Utrecht reported an increase than a decrease in travel expenses when reflecting on the uptake of shared micromobility in Utrecht. Overall, we found that shared bicycle and shared e-scooter use benefits low-income people's mobility more in the UK. We found that shared e-bike use benefits low-income people's mobility less in the UK. We found that shared e-moped use benefits both groups' mobility, so both groups being the high-income group and the low-income group. It benefits both groups' mobility equally in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Another trend that we see in many European cities is that shared micromobility gives people more options. And in this way, it can improve with different transportation options. This is also something that's happening and that's mentioned in many policy documents. So what this means is that shared micromobility has the potential to facilitate multimodality in two different ways. So first, by mode substitution, where a person who drives to work, so for example, trip one is someone driving to work, and then trip two is they drive to the gym. But then for trip three, which they used to, they're going to buy groceries, and they used to do it by car. Now there's micromobility available, shared micromobility. So they decide for that third trip, which is to buy a loaf of bread, that they're going to do that with a with a scooter, for example, shared micromobility service. So here we can see that multimodality can be influenced by the availability of shared micromobility. Multimodality can also occur when micromobility complements other modes. For example, such as for a first or last mile trip, which is what we see in the bottom of this slide, where there's a bike used to go to a train, and then there's a scooter used to go to a destination after taking a bus. And so together with Xinshen Fu, this is work from her PhD project, which is ongoing, and my colleague Dick Ettema, we assessed what multimodalism looks like and find that there's a huge range between people. So people are multimodal in all different kinds of ways. So for example, some people travel frequently using shared micromobility services, while others more frequently use other modes, for example, traditional modes. Some people occasionally use shared micromobility, while others tend to rely on their own private micromobility modes. So maybe they use a combination of bicycle and scooter, for example. Some people do not use any kind of shared micromobility at all, while others have a strong preference for a particular mode. So in this figure, it's not important to be able to read all the details of the figure here. I mean, this is too small. Some of you might have excellent eyes and can read that, but that's not the point of showing you these patterns. It is of interest to observe that there are multimodal shared mobility users in each and every city. And here again, we're looking at Utrecht, at Greater Manchester, and at Malmö. And what we can see here in the top right-hand quadrant of these figures, these three circles, is that there are users who use shared micromobility, who frequently use shared micromobility in each of the cities. So what we find then in our analysis is that shared micromobility users are more multimodal than non-users, meaning that shared micromobility does have the potential to facilitate multimodality. Travel patterns mainly differ in personal attributes and less so in where you live. This means that tailoring shared micromobility services to target population segments characterized by their personal attributes is very important. We also find that travel patterns and user characteristics vary in cities, and that shared micromobility plays a different role in cities with different urban settings and mobility systems, and should be integrated into existing transport systems, depending, of course, on the local context. All right, so as we transition to a new mobility landscape, we all need to rethink travel. And we've gone back in history to see this shift from car-centric to a focus on how we can improve a cycling networks, active travel. And now we again see we have more and more people moving to urban areas, different urban challenges. With the space that we have, how can we make mobility options available so that everyone can get to all the places they want when they want to? Is sharing an option? And for many people, it is. Sharing mobility is an option, whether that's a shared electric cargo bike, which is my personal preference when it comes to shared mobility, something I very often use. Other people prefer shared cars or shared electric bicycles. This is much more space effective, economic, and often also socially sustainable than all relying on our own private modes. So it's important that we consider the policies, but that we also consider the needs of the different residents, that we consider the users, and that the planners provide their visions about rethinking mobility. And I think it's very important that we also understand and engage in discussion with not only researchers, but also activists, and try and understand what they are trying to what their goals are when it comes to how the limited public space that we have for mobility needs to be used in the most effective way that's inclusive to different groups of people. So with that, I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank my co-authors, who you can see their lovely faces and photos here. And I welcome any questions.
Thank you. Okay. So we'll start by some questions in the room, or I can start online, whatever you guys want. You can stop sharing if you want to see their faces. Okay, I'll start with one question online that came from Zvi in Montreal. He was asking about if you have seen any research comparing when the micromobility, like in Montreal, you know, the Big C, we have stations, and he wants to ask if you have seen the differences between the free floating as you have in the Netherlands, where you can park the bike anywhere, compared to something like the Big C. Have you seen any comparisons of studies comparing these two? Because he thinks that something like Big C helps more in the public transit integration.
So the question is about the effectiveness of free floating versus docked
Exactly.
shared bicycle systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are different studies that assess the effectiveness of this. I think it depends what you are trying to measure in terms of effectiveness. In terms of integration with public transport, for example, having a dock like a Bixi system makes for a very limited amount of bicycles available at a station. Whereas you have dockless, there might be more flexibility to have more bikes at a certain moment of the day, because there's no capacity constraint there. Many dockless systems, these days use geofencing. So you don't see the dock, but there is still a very specific place that these bicycles can and cannot be. So the completely free floating systems are becoming they're becoming more rare. They're becoming less common. There are pros and cons to both. One of the issues that can happen with the systems that are not docked is that they can become problematic for other people sharing public spaces. So pedestrians, other sidewalk users, they can become obstacles that you can trip on, that are parked in places that are that become a hazard for other users. So there are definitely pros and cons to both systems. And I think the selection in what you're trying to achieve in a city is a very important question to have a clear answer on before selecting for one system or the other.
Any questions in the room? Okay, let's start with the. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the presentation. I've been to Utrecht and I love the bike network, so it's awesome. I have a question about aging populations. Like you were mentioning, our populations are aging. And so there's maybe a technological barrier, other accessibility barriers for this group of users. If maybe they're not able to use bikes per se or scooters, is there another solution that is like currently being applied, like micro buses or anything like that? Or what's kind of the research around that?
I didn't hear the point about buses. But I can answer the question generally. So there's an aging population, yes. And well, first of all, there are many older adults who are still active and fit and happy to use shared micromobility. It is true that as we age, using faster modes or using more vulnerable modes, such as a bicycle, sometimes becomes less attractive. And so I would say car sharing is a very good option. That there's been a lot of attention here, and yeah, as I mentioned, the car sharing services have increased a huge amount. But I think it also goes back to the question of public space, because if we are developing cities for older adults, we need to not only consider the modes that we can ride, that we can get onto, but also how do we get to those modes, the public spaces. So that space from someone's door to the bus stop, the crosswalk that needs to be crossed. Are there resting places? Are there benches? Are there places to sit? Is the pavement smooth? And so this is all related to the flow of how people move. where people need to get to, and really engaging communities and understanding what their needs are in this system. And as we have more and more people moving to cities growing, you could see here, I mentioned that Utrecht is expected to grow by 100,000 people. And that means that the mobility networks will be busier. They will become busier. So how do you conceptualize this? How do you think about this? One trend that I have heard in discussions with policies and planners here is that some of the bicycle networks, or in some areas, we see that children are starting to ride later and older adults are starting to stop at an earlier. And let's not fully understand why that is yet. But there is a lot of attention going into this to try to better understand what would make a safe cycling environment or a safe public space and pedestrian environment, not only for an older adult, but also for a young child who's traveling to school, or all the activities that they do outside of school.
Thank you.
But raise your voice.
My question was kind of going off the first question. This is in the Netherlands, I guess it's more like free floating versus our big city here has stations. I know big city has a lot of issues with like the dispersion of the bikes throughout the city, and like the demand is like everyone's going downtown in the morning and then there's no bikes in the rest of the city. Is that kind of an equity issue that we face if like all the bikes are always going to the same neighborhoods, like that?
Yeah, your question is whether the redistribution issue of bike sharing systems is related to equity planning. I actually have seen very little research on this, so maybe a good thing for your thesis if you're still looking for a topic. But yeah, certainly we see that certain people work at certain times, right? And not all jobs and all job types fall within this 9 to 5 classic working day schedule. So there might be a situation where particular kinds of micromobility, whether it's docked or dockless, are not available in a neighborhood at the time, or in the neighborhood that you need it at the time of day that you need it. I can't think of any particular studies, and also the studies that we've done ourselves here, trying to understand whether docked versus dockless is better for redistribution when it comes to equity and allocation. But it's a good question.
Okay, let's go online. Misha has his hand raised from Toronto. Misha, please.
Yeah, thanks, Alvin. Hi, Dea. Thanks for the presentation. My question, I was very interested in these mobility hubs. They're fairly new to me, and it's fun to see what's happening in Utrecht. Do you know what they come at the expense of what modes? Are people replacing active modes or transit with these new shared mobilities, or is it really single occupant car commutes that are being replaced?
Yeah, so a mode substitution question. Well, I guess there's two sides to that substitution. What used to be in the spot of those hubs? So usually parking is being removed, car parking is being removed, and then not in all cases though. I'm thinking now of just the hubs that I've been to, but mostly it's car parking is being removed and space is being made for shared cars or electric cars, and then sometimes also shared vehicles. And there seems to be a combination of both substitution and complement effects.
Thanks.
A PhD question from Professor Badami as part of your PhD defense. Why is he noticed the public transit ridership is actually mode share is small. Do you have any explanation why it's so small? In the very second or third slide you showed us, it was like 4 or 5%, I think. But like the bicycle is big, and then the car is 35, if I can remember, and bicycle is 35.
If we're talking about trips within the city, then the bicycle is a very convenient way to travel. So you'll, because of ease, comfort, travel time, also just what people do with their families, with their social environment. The bicycle network is very reliable, so it makes a lot of sense to do shorter trips within the city. And the city is also fairly small to do that with active travel, with a bicycle.
Any questions here? Okay, we have many questions. Okay, Hilda.
Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask if you took into account in your study the weather conditions.
Sorry, I can't hear this question.
She's asking about weather conditions. So in your studies, did you look at the differences in weather between the regions on the time you collected the surveys for the usage?
I don't think we controlled for weather, but I also think that the weather was quite similar in all these areas because we collected the data at the same time. I could go back and check though, but I believe that the weather was quite similar in the 3 areas at the time.
Professor Capacilla from Iowa is asking, are you aware of any presentations? Are you a great presentation first and insightful? Are you aware of any Utrecht University's initiatives that address transport poverty, example, targeting student needs? Do you have any initiatives happening at the university to target students in transport poverty?
Is a question about students who are experiencing transport poverty themselves?
Or no, a program to help those living in transport poverties. So example, in the university, targeting students, trying to give them more options or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's one specifically for university students. Many university students here have discounted travel on public transport, so that's already one initiative. But individual municipalities, so shared micromobility, it's organized at the municipality level. So for example, here in Utrecht, based on your household income, there are initiatives where you are able to use certain kinds of services, including certain kinds of shared micromobility at a discount. If your income is below a certain level.
Let me go again. Another one from Zahra here from Montreal. She's asking you about, have you seen some research looking at the shared mobility within the context of the 15-minute city, the big initiatives that's happening now in Europe?
I think shared mobility is a very important aspect of the 15-minute city. Shared mobility it considers not only the mobility option, but also the public space aspect and the social aspect of travel. And these are very important parts of the 15-minute city goal also. Of course, the 15-minute city has to do with active travel, and particularly walking and cycling. And this is exactly what shared mobility promotes, the use of the bicycle over other modes, or walking in combination with other shared modes, specifically modes that are active modes.
I'll end with the last question online because I know it's getting late and you have some children waiting at home. So I know it's 6 o'clock almost at your time. So
7.
What?
7, almost 7. They should be in bed, the children.
Oh, yeah, I know it's late, so thank you so much for waiting and speaking with us. He's asking about the mobility hubs and how the locations are being selected. If you are aware of any references on that, in that research of the area of mobility hub, how it's being decided where they are.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have asked the same question, and I did not get a clear answer. So that's the best answer I can give you. I can say that it doesn't. When we did our analysis of socially vulnerable populations, the most socially vulnerable populations were not necessarily the ones to get the first mobility hubs. So I think there are different considerations being taken into account. Social vulnerability is one of them, but space constraints and potential users definitely are also being taken into account. I think also others, which I'm not aware of.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dea. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate that you stayed with us till 7. I thought time differences, it was 6 only. So I really appreciate that you stayed with us. and really happy to see you and to hear your talk. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you. Thank you very much. If anyone is interested in any of this research in more detail or any of the other research, then please write me an email. I'm happy to share either this presentation or more in-depth presentations or papers, or just have a chat with you. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for your questions also. And nice to see so many names and faces from the past.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
It was nice
Ahmed.
to see you.
Take
Bye.
care, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.